Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to next year's Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo. I'm the founding partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory and capital mobilization firm focused on addressing Africa's most complex development challenges. And today's conversation goes to the heart of one of the most urgent questions facing Africa. Who gets to develop and under what rules? For about 4 decades, African countries have been urged to liberalize, privatize, deregulate, shrink the size of the state, open their markets, attract foreign capital, and follow their comparative advantage. I mean, these elegant ideas were presented as economic common sense. Yet, the countries that actually industrialized, the UK, US, China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China of late, did not do all of these points I've made earlier on to develop. Indeed, they used tariffs, subsidies, directed credit, state-owned enterprises, and deliberate support for domestic firms. Having climbed the ladder, many of the developed countries discouraged others from using the same path. Indeed, they kicked away the ladder. For scholars, just very few scholars have kind of exposed this contradiction more than Professor Chang. Born in South Korea, educated in Seoul National University and Cambridge, Professor Chang is one of the world's leading heterodox economists. His books include Kicking Away the Ladder, Bad Samaritans, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, Edible Economics, and at least a half-dozen other books. At the heart of his work is a simple claim. Democracy is not delivered by markets alone. It is built through productive capabilities, firms, technology, learning, institutions, and working at scale. That's the question that sits at the center of Africa's development challenge, and that's the question we want to explore today. Professor Chang, welcome to Development Discourse.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And much of your work challenges the story I just recounted, that rich countries become rich through free markets, free trade, limited governments, and strong private property rights. In Kicking Away the Ladder, you argued they used precisely the policy instruments they now discourage developing countries like Nigeria and many in the global south from using. 23 years on from when you wrote the books, the constraints are arguably tighter. What is the single most important historical misunderstanding an African policymaker listening to us today must unlearn?
Yeah, well, the history of capitalism has been so kind of comprehensively rewritten that we have, myself included, that we have believed that the rich countries of today, starting with Britain and then US and Germany and France and everyone that developed on the basis of free trade and free market. Now, I grew up in South Korea. I was born in the early 1960s when South Korea's per capita income was basically at the same level as Nigeria's. Today, South Korean per capita income is something like $36,000. Nigeria's fluctuates between 2,000 and 3,000 depending on the oil prices. So I've lived through a most remarkable economic transformation, and of course the free market economists even try to present cases like Korea and Taiwan as examples of free trade and free market in the early days, although by the 1990s this distortion of facts that was widely rejected. But many people have argued, well, that maybe Japan has used directed credit, maybe South Korea had protectionism, but these are exceptions. Yeah, look at the British Empire, which rose to prominence through free market and free trade. Look at the U.S., land of the free. That free market economics. All the other countries have done it, and yeah, I mean, why do you want to learn from these weird people who eat their rice with chopsticks? Yeah. So that has been a very, very powerful machinery because in debating how developing countries develop, the free trade economies start from I mean, start the debate in this, if you like, a tilted playing field. Yeah, they don't have to prove that the free market makes the countries rich. Yeah, the debate is about how come three, four countries in East Asia have done it otherwise. Yeah, but in the book, the Kicking the Ladder, and many of my subsequent writing, I have revealed that actually to the European countries, the United States, they all have used protectionism, subsidies, sometimes state-owned enterprises, regulation, very strict regulations on foreign investment, and so on, in order to get where they are. And then now that they have reached that superior position, they are lecturing other countries not to use those policy tools. And yeah, that expression kicking the ladder comes from the 19th century, the German economist Friedrich List, who argued that, look, the English tell us Germans and the Americans, the two countries have were very much identified with each other at the time as the sort of the catching up countries. The English tell us Germans and Americans not to use protectionism, not to use government subsidies. But when you actually look at English history, when did they use that free trade, free market? It's only very recent. He was writing in the mid 19th century that Britain abolished tariffs and adopted the free market. Yeah? So the English are telling us not to use those things. It's like someone using a ladder to climb up to the top and kicking the ladder away so that others cannot follow. The interesting thing is that List actually learned of this protectionist theory called infant industry argument from the United States. List that was in political exile from one of the many German states in the early 19th century. And when he went there, that he was actually a supporter of the free trade because he was one of the leading advocates of the free trade agreement between German states. Yeah? The customs union between these the many fragmented German states that were signed in the early 19th century, called Zollverein, literally customs union.
Mhm.
And when he got to the United States, however, he learned this theory called infant industry argument, which says that the in the same way in which we protect and nurture our children until they grow up and can compete in the other labor market, developing countries need to protect their industries until they grow up and can compete in the international market. Yeah? And the Americans were practicing it at the time. Uh, they had very high tariff wall, the 40, 50% tariff at the time. Uh, and List realized that, yes, free trade between similar countries like the German states may be a good thing. But free trade between countries at different levels of economic development is that mainly beneficial for the richer countries. Yeah. So he reconciled these two positions and started advancing the argument in Germany. But the interesting thing is that this infant industry argument was invented by none other than the very first finance minister of the United States of America,
Interesting.
Alexander Hamilton. That's the guy you see on the $10 bill. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you have this the weird situation when the country that actually invented the most important protectionist argument that was subsequently used by Germany and then Japan and South Korea and today's China used to parade around the world saying that they were defenders of free trade. Now with Donald Trump, this the hypocrisy has been dropped. But and very interestingly, that Hamilton might have theorized this the practice, but he explicitly acknowledged that he got inspiration for his theoretical argument from the 18th century British practice. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that Britain is really the first country that used this infant industry protection. It used to be a very poor raw material producer, mainly relying on the export of unprocessed wool, and it wanted to develop woolen manufacturing and arms production and other manufacturing industries. And indeed, in the 18th century, it had one of the highest the protection in the world. Yeah?
Hmm.
So we
Yeah.
have this weird situation that the countries that were the most protectionist somehow parade around as the most the free trade economies.
But there are some scholars who've also pushed back, to say that maybe these countries grew despite those bad policies and that we shouldn't then be copying them, right? So people like Douglas, Irwin will talk about the role of tariffs in US development. McCloskey will talk about bourgeois values. Good friends Asemoglu and Robinson will talk about institutions as the things that then ultimately led to these economies growing, and that we shouldn't look at the protectionist policies because maybe those countries grew despite those bad policies.
Yeah,
How
no,
do you respond to that?
no, of course that this is the standard rebuttal, but let me give you a few kind of angles. I mean, first of all, okay, maybe they grew despite these policies, but then where is the free trade success story? Yeah? Because literally all the countries have used these measures. Okay, I mean, there were the partial exceptions like the Netherlands and the Switzerland, which until the First World War had very low tariffs, but they had other measures of government intervention, including the colonialism, but in the case of the Netherlands, which involved extracting a huge amount of resources from its colonies, mainly Indonesia. But these countries, on the other hand, deviated from the standard recommendation of today by refusing to have patent protection. Yeah,
Hmm.
because they were most of the time, although not entirely, practicing free trade, and they were at least consistent. They said, free trade, we are free trading nations, and we cannot possibly endorse artificially created monopolies like the patents. Yeah. So
Hmm.
they deviate from that. In modern days, for example, people say, "Oh, how about Singapore?" Yeah. Yes, Singapore practice free trade and welcome foreign investment. But did you know that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government?
Interesting.
85% of housing is provided by the government. and a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises,
Mm,
including the famous Singapore Airlines. Yeah? So
mm.
there's literally no case of but free market based success. Yeah. So
So,
okay that maybe that they got these countries grew despite protectionism, but then you will have to give me a case in which a country that grew on the basis of free market. Yeah. Another example,
okay. So, mm,
for example, that back in 1976, South Korea started producing its own cars. Yeah.
mhm,
And in that year, the biggest company was called Hyundai, which now is the third largest car company in the world. And that company produced 10,000 cars a year. Yeah? In the same year, Ford produced 1.9 million cars,
mhm.
and General Motors produced 4.8 million cars. Yeah? So if South Korea had free trade in automobile, this company would have been wiped out, yeah,
Completely.
overnight, yeah. But in order to make this company grow and develop, South Korean government literally banned the importation of all foreign cars until 1988 and banned the importation of the Japanese cars until 1998. Yeah. So if Irwin and all these people can tell me how South Korea could have developed its automobile industry without protection, because it was that at the time a country reliant on the export of the primary commodities and very, very labor intensive exports like t-shirts and human wigs and so on. Yeah. If they can tell me how the Korea could have developed its automobile industry, its semiconductor industry, its shipbuilding industry without protectionism, I'll believe them. Yeah. Thirdly, people like Asimoglu, they retrofit their conclusion into history. Yeah. What I mean
Mhm.
by this is they say, oh, that Britain and the US developed because of these inclusive institutions. Yeah. Inclusive, I'm sorry, but for example, the so-called inclusive institutions of the United States included slavery. Yeah, I mean, 20% of the population was excluded from even being a human being, not to speak of but sharing the prosperity. Yeah? In Britain, which is supposed to have invented all these inclusive institutions, in the Boer War of 1902, during which Britain invaded South Africa,
South Africa.
the difference in height between the officers recruited from the upper class and the soldiers
Yeah.
recruited from the working class, the difference in height was 5 inches. Yeah? I do not call a society where the lack of birth creates that 5 inch difference in height an inclusive society. Yeah? So this is all like starting from the conclusion that Britain and the US were the most successful economies, and whatever they have must have been a good thing, and you call that good thing inclusive institutions,
Yeah.
but it doesn't fit with that reality.
Okay. So let me push back again.
Mm.
And this is really about the selection problem, right? So some critics will argue that for every example you draw from like a South Korea or Taiwan, there is a Ghana under Nkrumah or a Tanzania under Nyerere or even Nigeria, in the 1970s. And these are countries that, again, pursued protectionism policies, state-led industrialization, but instead of transformation, they yielded stagnation. So how do we respond to this charge that maybe the examples you pick are cherry picked, to speak to this idea? And how do we really
Mhm.
distinguish between successes and failures if we were to pick industries to support, etc.?
Yeah. Well, first of all, whenever people recommend something, whether it's a personal habit or the study method for students or industrial policy for that matter, they inevitably look at the success cases. Yeah. So it's talking about Korea in terms of industrial policy, talking about the United States in the 19th century in terms of the value of protectionism. I mean, I'm not doing anything weird. Yeah. I mean, these people are picking that point only because they don't like the conclusion. Yeah. But on a more serious note, first of all, yes, the South Korea, for every South Korea, you probably have 10 Ghanas, but
Yeah. Mhm.
the protectionist or more broadly, the interventionist policies in the developing world in the 1960s and 70s, in Africa, in Latin America, the results were far superior to what we have had in the last 4 decades of neoliberalism. Yeah? So in the 1960s and 70s, per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa, according to the World Bank classification, grew at the rate of 1.6%. Yeah? During that period, the per capita income in South Korea grew at 6%. So yes, it was much uh, inferior to what South Korea managed. But first of all, you have to realize that this was still a very respectable rate. The
Mhm.
rate of per capita income growth during the so-called Industrial Revolution in Europe during the 19th century was not even 1.2%. Yeah? So actually, the African countries did rather well by the historical standard. I mean,
Mhm.
the exception was Korea and so on. In the next 40 years, per capita income in Sub-Saharan Africa has grown at 0.3% per year. Yeah? This means that per capita income in the Sub-Saharan Africa in, say, 2020 was 6% higher than what it was in 1980. Yeah?
Mm.
China used to grow the 6% in half a year. Yeah? So what are we talking about? The interventionist policies in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and so on in the 60s and 70s may not have been as successful as that of South Korea's, but these are definitely much higher than in the subsequent neoliberal period. In Latin America, the per
Mm.
capita income growth rate collapsed from 3.1% in the 60s and 70s to 0.8% in the next 4 decades. Yeah?
Mm. Mm. Mm.
On
Mm.
top of
So,
that, yes, the South Korea, Taiwan, these countries did much better with these interventionist policies because they basically did them better. Yeah? They were much more willing and able to discipline the recipients of protection and subsidies. Yeah? They had to deliver. Yeah? These the protected firms had to invest, had to raise productivity, increase export. Yeah? If they didn't perform, but the support was discontinued. Yeah? There were, I mean, the other things that we could discuss later, but
so
yeah. But
it, it-
so you have to acknowledge that there was a sort of quality difference in the industrial policy between the more successful countries and less successful countries. But the point is that even the less successful interventionist policies have produced a much better result than the subsequent 4 decades of neoliberalism.
mm. And there's an example, you used at the beginning of our talk, where you said, back in time, Korea was much poorer than Nigeria and some of these other African countries, Kenya, etc. And then the GDP per capita has grown. Um, and but I saw this Substack post by a young scholar, Oliver Kim, where he showed that even at the time, South Korea had more people per capita who had, graduate degrees, et cetera, than many of these African countries. My question, therefore, is there a minimum threshold of capacity that a state is required to have before it can begin to pick and choose which industries, which sectors to protect? And is that the missing link here? And if it is, what is that minimum threshold? And how do we know when we're there to begin to attempt some of these policies?
Yeah, I'm not convinced by those arguments that say that South Korea had the better educated people and more people with industrial experience and so on. Yeah, there was a bit of difference, but first of all, the difference was not huge. That when the Japanese left, the literacy rate in South Korea was 22%. Yeah. Okay, maybe it
Mm-hmm.
was at the 15 or 11 in many African countries, but it wasn't as if the Japanese were somehow, yeah, the more enlightened colonizers, and they hugely educated the Korean population. Yeah? In terms of bureaucratic capability that people are worried about when we discuss industrial policy, I would like to remind people that until the late 1960s, South Korea was given money by the World Bank to send these government officials to countries like the Philippines and Pakistan. Yeah. Now, today you might
Mm.
think, wow, that how was that possible? But at the time, the Philippines was the second richest country in East Asia after Japan. Yeah? At the
Mm.
time, Pakistan was slightly poorer than Korea, but it had was the golden boy of the World Bank, because it had a lot of Oxbridge educated economists who were 10 times better than any Korean government official in terms of their economics. Yeah? Most Korean economic bureaucrats at the time had their first degrees in law. Yeah? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
very few of them were economists, and what little economics they knew were of the wrong kind. Yeah, because
Mm.
those people got their economics education during the Japanese colonial period, and at the time, Japanese economics was dominated by Marxists and Schumpeterians and the Austrians and so on, rather than the English, yeah, the neoclassical the traditions, yeah, they were not even many Keynesians, yeah, and then how do you I mean, how would you assess the capabilities of those people? Yeah?
Yeah.
Most importantly, when the people make this argument, I once wrote this the paper showing how the so-called initial conditions in terms of the infrastructure and educational achievement and industrial experiences that are supposed to have created all these differences between the East Asia and the Africa were minimal. Yeah, the
Mm-hmm.
differences were minimal. Yeah, if you, I mean, basically in almost all of these areas, if you threw Taiwan into Africa, it would be kind of in the top third. Yeah, Korea
Yeah.
was even less developed. If you threw Korea in, it would be below average. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't really believe these arguments. Yeah.
Mm. Mm.
Having said that, the most important point is that these capabilities are what you develop. Yeah? And in developing these capabilities, you acquire capabilities by practicing these policies. Yeah?
Mm. Mm.
Because if you just looked at the government bureaucratic capabilities in South Korea in the say the mid 1960s when they were
16. Mm-hmm.
starting this the industrialization drive, I mean, you think these people shouldn't do anything, yeah? So really, I mean, I can tell you that if the first 2 5-year economic development plans of South Korea was submitted to me as a report by an undergraduate student, I would have probably given it C minus, yeah. Just so basic, so awful, yeah. I mean, at the time, the Indians were conducting this sophisticated debate on the Mahalanobis model and the sectoral balances, and you know, yeah. So saying that all the countries that should not kind of try any complicated policy is like saying that, well,
Mm,
you at the moment only have the high school diploma, so you should always stick to the low level jobs. Yeah,
mm.
you should. I mean, I really don't understand because when it comes to individuals, these free market economists say, oh, try to become the next Steve Jobs. Yeah, try to become the next the Barack Obama. Yeah, when it comes to countries, they say, no, 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 you should stick to the growing soybeans. Yeah, pumping oil out. Yeah, you should never try anything better. Yeah, why is there a difference?
In fact, yeah, that's a good segue to my question on comparative advantage, right? Which you've written a lot on. And
Sure.
conventional trade theory tells us poor countries to specialize according to our comparative advantage. But you have argued that development often requires these same countries to defy their existing comparative advantage in order to construct something better.
Yeah.
Um, Justin Lin argues the opposite, that countries should follow their endowments. Where exactly do you draw the line between these strategic capability building and what could then become white elephant vanities?
Yeah. Well, you know, in the short run, it is important to take your comparative advantage seriously. But, this idea of comparative advantage is very often misunderstood. Yeah. Comparative advantage simply means that you might be rubbish at everything, but there must be something at which you are the least rubbish at. And that's what you need to specialize. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or that you might be good at everything, but you shouldn't try to do everything. You should specialize in something that you are the best at, and specialize in those things. Yeah. So comparative in this story is comparison between different activities that you could possibly be engaging in. Yeah, it's not a comparison between you and the United States. It's not a comparison between you and Brazil. Yeah, so that as a result of this misunderstanding, some, I mean, I've heard some fairly famous economists saying things like, "Oh, such and such, the poor country in Africa doesn't have comparative advantage in anything." Yeah, no, that's a logical impossibility. Yeah, you
exactly.
have to have comparative advantage in something. Yeah, now
Exactly.
comparative advantage in the short run, yes, that defines your horizon, yeah? Because if you are South Korea in the 1970s, trying to produce things like automobile and semiconductor in which you have no comparative advantage whatsoever, you are actually hurting yourself, yeah? But the point is that by hurting yourself in the short run, you are creating the possibility that you could have a space in which you can develop new capabilities to do better things, yeah, more productive things, yeah. So that the hint is in the name, infant industry protection, yeah. So in order to explain this, I once in my book Bad Samaritans wrote this chapter called "My 6-year-old son should get a job." Yeah. Now he's now 26, but when I wrote the book, he really was 6 years old. And in the book, I don't use such a strong language, but basically, I'm saying, look, I have this 6-year-old son. He is basically a parasite. Yeah, I mean, I pay for everything. Yeah, his lodging, his food, his clothing, his education, his TV, his Nintendo games, which was very popular at the moment in those
At the
days.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I realized that actually this guy could go and work. Yeah, I mean, there are literally hundreds of millions of children in poor countries who start working from the age of 4 or 5. Yeah, so
Yeah.
why can't he work? Yeah, and then I realized that this is a win-win solution because by making him work, I save a lot of money because
Hmm.
he will earn his keep. He will become a better person. Yeah,
Yeah.
no more wasting time in front of TV. No more, the wasting time with Nintendo games. He'll have to, I don't know, practice the whatever trade that he's going to pry. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
shoe shining, chewing gum selling. Yeah, whatever. So why do I not do it? Yeah, why do all these free trade economists who recommend maximum competition from day one, not send their kids to work and send them to school. Yeah, I don't know about those guys, but I at the time I didn't do it because he's quite a clever kid. I mean, if I supported him for another 12, 15 years, he could become lots of things. I mean, the architect, nuclear physicist, what have you. But I mean, of course, that there's a chance that he will turn out to be a waste of time, and that could be subsidized by me until he's at 45. But I would take the risk because he that will never become one of those things if he starts working from the age of 4 or 5. Yeah, because he'll be
Exactly.
stuck with those low skill jobs. Yeah, yeah. So comparative
Which
advantage
is what
is
has
like
happened to
that. I
many
mean,
of us.
yeah. When
Hmm.
you're 6, his comparative advantage would be in shoe shining and selling chewing gums. Yeah, if he
Lemonade.
keeps doing that, he will never be able to acquire higher capabilities to allow him to become a biologist, as he later became, or an architect. Yeah? As
Yeah,
simple
but
as that. Yeah.
yeah, but it raises other questions, right?
Hmm.
Developmental state versus a rent distributing state. So many African countries have had these extensive state interventions, and I mentioned some of them earlier on: protection, subsidy, state-owned enterprises, import restrictions, etc. But this has often produced rent for the elite, right? Rather than learning. So, what separates a development state from a rent distributing state? And, is it about institutions? Is it about political coalitions? Is it about ideology? Or is it something else entirely?
Mm. Yeah. You know, developmental states that created huge amount of rents. Yeah, by providing the protection to firms that would be wiped out if there was a free trade by channeling huge amount of subsidies through sometimes government budget, but mainly through the government-owned banks and so on. So, I mean, rent creation of rent itself is not the difference. Yeah, the difference is what do you need to do in order to get access to these rents. Yeah. So in the more successful cases, you had to deliver. Yeah? You have to deliver productivity growth. You have to deliver the jobs. You have to deliver the export. And if you don't, there are consequences. Yeah? In the less successful cases, you kind of get these rents, but you don't have to deliver. Yeah? So that once again, going back to the infant industry argument, it is imperative that you need to send the kid to school. But the point is that the kid has to study. Yeah, you have to make the kid study. You have to help the kid study.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. If he only goes to school and doesn't study, is worse than him, but going to work at the age of 5. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is the difference. Yeah. Now exactly how you kind of solve the problem, but exactly why there was this difference. I mean, it's that it can be only understood in terms of the complex the historical story about differences in the ideology, political coalition, individual leaders, and so on. So you cannot really generalize, but I mean, insofar as we can generalize, you need the elite to be committed to productivity growth and investment and the economic success. Yeah, you need the elite to be able and willing to discipline the recipients of these rents. Yeah. So, for example, the reason why you had to listen to what the government told you to do in South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s and 70s were not simply military dictatorship, which both countries had at the time, but the ownership of literally all the banks by the government. Yeah? So it's a bit
Mm.
like the relationship between the World Bank and developing countries in the 1980s and 90s. Yeah? If you don't listen to the World Bank, you don't get money. Yeah? If you don't listen to the
Exactly.
government, you don't get money. Yeah? Of course, the important thing is that this government was committed in its own brutal way to investment, export, productivity growth, and eventual global economic success. Yeah.
They had the capability to do that, and I think that's where I'm
Yeah,
struggling a
but the
bit.
point is
When
that
it comes
that
to
capability was created, yeah,
mm,
because that one of the first things that the military government did in South Korea when it took power in 1961 in a military coup was to nationalize all the banks. So you have to create
mhm.
this
Okay, I mean,
capability, yeah.
you've had development build institutions as well as institutions enabling development. How should African countries think about sequencing? And what is the minimum institutional flaw below which transformation becomes impossible?
Yeah. Uh, well, I think it's wrong to see it as a sequencing because it has to be a interactive process. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you have to start with whatever poor institution that you have. Yeah. And then that you do what you can, and then that allows you to improve the quality of institutions because you are now richer, you have more experience, yeah, and you keep doing that, yeah.
Mhm.
So to say that you first need to reform the institutions before you can even start growing is based on complete historical misunderstanding. As I keep telling you, South Korea did not have this super duper state, yeah, when it started this development experience, yeah. So in my book Kicking the Ladder, I in great detail document how the quality of institutions in today's rich countries when they were developing were far far worse than what developing countries have today. Yeah. Okay, I mean there are a few countries that in which that extended civil war and that the political crisis that make it impossible to do anything that long-term oriented. But almost all developing countries today have way more than the institutional capabilities that the rich countries had in the 19th, early 20th century when they were industrializing. Yeah? So I don't really buy this
Mm.
argument that it's because of low quality of institution that Nigeria cannot develop. Is that because of exclusive institutions or whatever that
Yeah.
Kenya will not develop. This is just that once again retrofitting, you know, history into your theory.
Yeah. But again, if we look at development history, right, it suggests that most of the jobs are created through manufacturing, productivity, learning, jobs, export, etc., etc. And it appears that Africa is now trying to industrialize in a world of AI, automation, Chinese dominance, and very fragmented value chains, and so on and so forth. Is manufacturing-led path still available to us as late developers? And if not, what should structural transformation actually mean for countries like Nigeria and others in Africa?
No, manufacturing is still the key because that's where productivity growth that happens. Yeah, it's
Even if
the
even if we missed the skills we should have acquired in the third industrial revolution, and we're now in the fourth industrial revolution, AI, automation, how
Yeah,
are we
well,
going to play?
to begin with, automation. History of capitalism is history of automation. Yeah, automation has
Okay.
always happened. Okay, I mean this time, but the kind of mental labor is being automated, unlike the other times. But actually, this that makes the case for manufacturing stronger. Yeah, because a lot of jobs are going to disappear in the service sector. The consulting firms are the shedding labor. Law firms are shedding labor. So actually, it might be good for the manufacturing industries. But apart from that, I mean, the automation is something that has gone on for 2.5 centuries. Yeah? So there's nothing new about it. Of course, the sectors that it affects and the scale of changes and so on that differ, in different times. But the automation itself shouldn't be an argument against manufacturing. The China factor is a bit more serious, but let's put it into perspective. These days China is, of course, the biggest manufacturing nation, producing 30% of world manufacturing output. Yeah, the US produces only 16, 17%. Yeah, and it's the second biggest. Yeah, but you have to remember that in the 1950s, yeah, the US produced 60% of world manufacturing output. Yeah, and countries like the Korea, Taiwan, these countries industrialize within that environment. Yeah? If China producing 30% of manufacturing output is so dominating that other countries shouldn't even try, I mean, it would have been insane for countries like Korea and Taiwan to try to industrialize that in the 50s and 60s when the US produced way, way more in proportional terms than what China is producing today. Huh? Also,
Mm-hmm.
don't
Mm-hmm.
forget that China might be dominating in many manufacturing sectors, but it is shedding some other lower grade manufacturing industries, and until the country imploded because of the civil war, Ethiopia took big advantage of that by importing labor intensive manufacturing from China. Yeah? Also, China doing so well that means that you have a bigger market. Yeah, I mean that, and you can export manufacturing products that China doesn't engage in anymore, and then use that to climb up the ladder. Just remember when China started its industrialization, it was basically only producing cheap labor products. Yeah? So did Korea and Taiwan. Yeah? But these countries eventually succeeded exactly because they didn't stop there. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
give up, but because the Japanese are already producing the nice electronic goods, the Germans are already producing nice cars, Americans are already producing semiconductors. They said, well, we can do them. Yeah? We can do them better. And they are doing them better. Yeah? So that's how you have to see it. And China is now responsible, if you like. I mean, now is going to give tariff-free access to almost all African countries to its market. Yeah, I mean, people complain that but then it's increasing is the non-tariff barriers and so on. But yes, I mean, this is your chance. Yeah, I mean, if
Hmm.
1.3 billion people want
Yep,
something that you are producing, then you have an almost unlimited market. Yeah.
exactly.
Why are you not doing that? Yeah?
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's very easy to find excuses not to do something difficult. Yeah.
But
But
isn't
then
it
only when you do it that you will make a difference.
fantastic? But isn't there a deeper question that we need to engage here, which is like, for because most policymakers who are on this call, senior government people, when we think about industrialization, we're thinking about, foreign direct investment coming in to build out these industries. In fact, the point you made about China leaving some of the lower tech production, some of that could move to Africa. But there's a big question, and your work suggests that what really matters is whether these foreign direct investment builds domestic capabilities,
Yeah.
or creates, enclaves where we're learning. How should African countries actually structure their engagement with foreign capital? And what does successful technology transfer look like in practice?
Mm-mm. Yeah, foreign capital will never do it without being made to do it. Yeah. I mean, they will not build your local capabilities. This is why Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and later China use all kinds of formal and informal means to force them to transfer technology, train workers, to localize their suppliers. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, without doing that, why should they develop your capabilities? So the government has to be determined to do it. I mean, of course, in the beginning, you cannot be too picky, but that sooner or later you will have to develop the capabilities that will allow you to create your own global value chain. I mean, South Korea is a classic example. Yeah, electronics is one of the leading electronics the producers in the world. But in the beginning, what did we do in terms of electronics, the electrical, we were assembling transistor radios for Japanese companies. We were assembling color TVs for American companies. Yeah, we were doing the very final kind of the assemblage of the
Page. Yeah.
semiconductors for American companies. Yeah. Yeah, so that if we didn't invest in building our own capabilities, if we didn't push the foreign companies to transfer at least some of its technologies to Korean joint venture partners, we would still be assembling those things. Yeah, I mean there are countries which are stuck with it, like the Philippines. Yeah, Philippines that exports huge amounts of high tech electronic goods. Yeah, but it's all designed by someone else, but in and assembled in factories run by someone else, and the Filipinos only provide the final labor. Yeah. So how do you use foreign investment to move up the value chain? I mean, you have to have a determined policy, huh? Because they are never going to let you
Do it on
develop.
their
You
own.
just, yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. And just to say to participants, we're going to open it up for questions in another few minutes. But please type your questions in the Q&A tab, not in the chat room. It's difficult for us to pick it up from the chat room, but put it in the Q&A tab. I will pose the question to him and give full attribution to the person who posed the question. But Hajun, so if you were advising a Nigerian president, for instance, a Nigerian president that's got like a 4-year mandate, but has to contend with weak bureaucracy, fiscal constraints, corruption challenges, a federal political system, what would be the minimum viable industrial policy? What would it look like? I mean, what would be like three things that you would insist that this president does, and what are the three things that they shouldn't do?
Well, yeah, first of all, you have to create this long-term political consensus towards a more productive the development strategy. Yeah? And it's another given. I mean, even the more successful countries had to go through huge amount of the political turmoil and kind of even wars to create that. Yeah, for example, people think the American Civil War was only about slavery, but it was also about development strategy. Yeah? Because the southern slave states did not want protectionism. Yeah, they wanted free trade because they could use the enslaved Africans to produce cotton and tobacco and import manufactured products which are not only better but also cheaper from Europe. Yeah? So why should they give up kind of their free trade position? The Republicans, actually, Abraham Lincoln was the first ever Republican Party president. The Republicans were basically protectionists. They said we need to protect our economy, and that created huge conflict in the U.S., which resulted in this war. Yeah? And only because of the war, the U.S. Became firmer in its protectionist policy and could overtake England. Yeah? In Germany, in the late 19th century, at the time when Bismarck unified the country, Germany had that very low protection. Yeah? Basically the free trade policy because Bismarck's the main political ally were the liberals who were free traders. Yeah? But Bismarck changed this the path by creating what historians call the marriage of iron and rye. Yeah? Which comes from the fact that basically this was a time when new heavy and chemical industries like iron and steel and the artificial dyes and so on were coming up, but the German producers in those industries were struggling against British superior British competition. Yeah? And they wanted protection, but Bismarck couldn't give it to them. But then he brokered this new political coalition by offering his the main political supporters, the landlords in Prussia, called the Junkers, who were mainly growing rye. Yeah? And they were being battered by import of wheat or superior grain from the United States because this was a time when the railways and the steamships came on board and they were being battered. Yeah? So he
Yeah.
told his landlord friends, look, I'll give you the protection against American grains, yeah, but you have to give me protection for those iron producers in the western part of Germany. Yeah?
Mhm.
So this marriage was born, and then that was the critical move that enabled Germany to become another highly industrialized nation. Yeah. So you need to do something
Yeah.
like that. I mean, I'm not recommending war, but you have to create this long-term consensus. Yeah, because if you don't, every 4 years, government policies will move from one direction to another. Yeah. So you do protectionism for 4 years, and then you drop all this. Very few industries will mature in 4 years. Yeah, so that it will be very easy to easy for the opposition to say, look, this is not
Yeah.
working, yeah?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, they come in with a free trade policy, which will destroy industries, yeah? And then the previous party will say, no, that this is destroying our economy. We have to introduce protectionism again, yeah? You cannot do that. I mean, you have to create some kind of minimum national consensus that will enable you to move into the right direction. So you need your president, whoever it is, to start this conversation and try to build this consensus so that, yeah, I mean, there'll be a range in a democracy. I mean, you will, under one government, become more market oriented, in another more state oriented, but
Sure.
you know it should be within a reasonable range. I mean, you cannot have the libertarian president one year and then a socialist president another.
Socially. Yeah.
And even
Which
if they are in some ways libertarian and socialist, there has to be some kind of core policies that are protected because it takes a lot of time to develop these industries. Yeah, I
time
mean,
and effort.
yeah, Samsung Semiconductor, which is now one of the biggest semiconductor companies in the world, lost money for 10 straight years when it was first established. Yeah? Because they were the Americans and then the Japanese and they
Yeah.
couldn't just make money in the beginning. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the recognizing that it takes 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to develop a serious industry, you need to have the kind of long-term consensus that will
Yeah.
allow you to do at least some of the things without being disturbed by change of government. Yeah?
Yeah.
So I would
Yeah.
say that's the most important thing. Yeah?
And we can work with that. I have a question from Professor Richard Joseph. I mean, his landmark book, Democracy and Prebendal Politics in Nigeria, remains a foundational study on Nigerian politics. And his question is, the central question you have not addressed is how countries develop the capabilities to pursue appropriate policies. You have stated for decades now that South Korea and other Asian developmental states did it. There's a gap in how the capacity to develop capacities can be breached. We need you to join that critical investigation. Any
Mm,
response to
thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, you first need the political capacity to carry out this the long-term strategy. And yeah, it often involves as I mentioned earlier, the violent and unpleasant processes. I mean, for example, one thing that really made it possible for countries like Korea to pursue this long-term oriented strategy that was the land reform, yeah, which eliminated the landlord class, which, as seen in the case of America's slave owners, don't like the protectionism, don't like the development of manufacturing. Yeah? But I mean, those the structural thing that only define the realm of possibility. And what you do requires the political leadership. Yeah? So in South Korea, we had the first president of the republic. He, between 1948 and 1960, he was our Marie Antoinette. Yeah? He was someone who was a member of a minor branch of the former royal family. He got his PhD in Princeton under Woodrow Wilson, who used the former American president, who used to be professor there. And yeah, I mean that he married this aristocratic Austrian lady. Well, Marie Antoinette originally comes from Austria, but it's not because of that I call him our Marie Antoinette. I mean, he was a very famous anti-Japanese fighter, but he couldn't care less about ordinary people. Yeah? So when one year his agriculture minister told him, "Sir, we have a terrible rice shortage," and he blurted out, "That's the bloody problem with the Koreans." Yeah. all they want to eat is rice. Why don't they eat beef? Why don't they eat the wheat? Yeah, they are more nutritious. And the agriculture minister didn't have the guts to tell him, so we don't produce those things. Yeah. In contrast, our military dictator, General Park, he was a very, very nasty man, but at least he cared about ordinary people. I mean, I still remember in his autobiography, there's this passage where he says, I was traveling on a train as a young officer of the the Japanese Imperial Army, which he was. And in front of me was sitting this beautiful young high school girl who was reading a book of French poetry. And her hands were like jade, so beautiful. And then he goes, I hated those hands. These are hands of the people who ruined our country, sitting on their land, smoking opium, but reading the French poetry. I hate those people. We need to rebuild the country. So, structure doesn't determine the outcome. You need political leadership, and then you need bureaucratic capabilities, how to run things, and not just in the government, but also in the enterprises. Yeah?
Private sector. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, your country already has proven that there are such talents in the person of Mr. Dangote. Why can't you have 10 Dangotes, not just one? Yeah. And yeah, as for these bureaucratic capabilities, whether it's in the government or in the private sector, there are things that can be built, not by necessarily sending people for special courses in the IMF and the master's degree in the Kennedy School in Harvard, but by actually doing these policies, because the academic training is rather useless, I mean,
Exactly.
no, I'm not saying it lightly. In the so-called miracle days in Japan, almost all the economic bureaucrats were lawyers by training. In Korea, there was a mixture of lawyers and engineers and economists, but economists were not dominant until the 80s. In Taiwan, in today's China, industrial policy is run by engineers and scientists. But when we think about government capabilities, we think in terms of MPA from Harvard and PhD in economics from Chicago. Those are not the capabilities that you want. You need people who are actually interested in making
Doing
things
stuff.
happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
willing to learn from their policy experiences.
Exactly. Exactly. I have a question from Abdul Rauf Aliyu, and he says, Professor Chang, your thesis in Kicking Away the Ladder is built on the idea that nations must have the policy space to experiment. However, in 2026, the ladder isn't just being kicked away, the ground itself is being digitized. With the rise of algorithmic governance and global digital platforms, the rules of the game are no longer just WTO laws, but proprietary codes owned by trillion-dollar firms. If the commanding heights of the economy are now virtual and stateless, does the nation state, the primary actor in all your theories, still possess the physical or intellectual agency to implement an industrial policy? Or are we prescribing a 20th century cure for a 21st century ghost?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you shouldn't overestimate the importance of these so-called platforms, because in the end, they are powerful only because it's controlled by a nation with money, namely the United States, and that nation had become wealthy on the basis of the strength of its manufacturing. Yeah? But why is Trump behaving in such a way? I mean, it's because he instinctively knows that the United States doesn't have this fundamental material dominance anymore. Yeah, I mean, as I told you, the share of the U.S. In global manufacturing used to be 60%. You know, now it's 16, 17. Yeah, I mean that it's a nation that whose military dominance is dependent on its ability to patrol the oceans with the aircraft carriers. Yeah? This nation now produces about 10 ships a year. Yeah? South Korea produces 700, China produces 1,700 a year. Yeah? They cannot make stealth bombers and all these high-tech weapons without the rare earth elements whose which are 90% produced in China. You know, the reason why Trump keeps backing off in his attempt to bully China is because then the Chinese say, we are not going to sell you those things. Yeah. So this is the fundamentally weakened nation, and this AI and all that stuff platform. You know, first of all, the American AI the boom is a huge bubble. It could burst anytime. And then we have the Chinese alternatives programs like DeepSeek, which are open source. Yeah, I mean we don't need to rely on the United States anymore. So yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to completely dismiss the U.S. dominance in these industries. I mean, it's a huge challenge, but I don't think that we want to overestimate this importance, and especially in the longer run, this cannot be sustained without the U.S. Reviving its manufacturing capabilities. Yeah? Unfortunately, what Donald Trump is doing is not going to achieve that. So good luck
Exactly.
to the Americans. Yeah.
Exactly. Too many questions to get through here. I have one from Obioro Kechuku. He says, Danny Roderick has argued that government develop by tackling binding constraints. What constraints do you think Nigeria and other African countries should tackle to start building these capabilities that you speak about?
Yeah, I'm not so sure whether there are any constraints that are uh, inevitably and permanently binding. Yeah, and also in different contexts, what are binding constraints that differ. So I think that the recommendation on those things can only come from someone who understands the historical and political history of the nation in question, because that in one country it might be a shortage of skilled labor, in another it might be the corruption in the economy, which yeah, I mean that in some countries is a huge problem, but it's something that these binding constraints are something that are specific to the context that we are talking about. So I don't think that we can generalize over it.
Great. I have a question from Chidinma Obi. Industrial policy requires the state to be close enough to business to coordinate, but autonomous enough to discipline. Korea achieved this under specific historical conditions. How can African countries build that autonomy under democratic conditions? For Nigeria, what is the most fundamental place to start driving structural transformation?
Yeah, I mean the idea was conceptualized as embedded autonomy by the great American sociologist Peter Evans, who wrote I mean about many important development experiences, both successes and failures. South Korea, Brazil, India. Yes, it's important that you kind of have a government that is in the communication with the private sector without being beholden to it. Yeah, it's not easy to achieve, but I think it's less difficult than many people think. For example, take the case of corruption. I think corruption is a very lazy way of describing your problem. Yeah, I mean, look at the United States. Yeah, I mean, I say that their corruption level is relatively low only because they have legalized most of it. Yeah, I mean, many of the things they can do in terms of political funding and so on, that will be
Exactly.
considered completely corrupt in other countries. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
you also all these the indexes of corruption and so on. They are very very biased towards the Western countries. Let me give you the very revealing anecdote. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2008, I visited Iceland, which had a huge crisis. Yeah? Iceland had been consistently listed as one of the top five least corrupt countries in the world by this organization called Transparency
Transparency.
International.
Yeah. Hmm.
When I got there, however, people told me that this guy called Otson, who used to be the prime minister of the country, was and then the architect of financial liberalization that created this huge financial boom and bust in the country. He had been just appointed as the editor of the biggest newspaper. And the most amazing thing is that this guy, after he stopped being the prime minister, basically appointed himself as the governor of the central bank. Yeah? And carried through all this the financial deregulation policy that he started as a prime minister. Yeah? And I told the Icelanders, look, I visited many developing countries which are criticized for being corrupt. Yeah? But I've never seen a country where the same guy was the prime minister, the central bank governor, and the editor of the biggest newspaper. Huh? You are completely corrupt. Yeah? And they said, yes, we are. Yeah? I asked them, then how come Transparency International list you as one of the least corrupt countries in the world? And they sheepishly said, we are a very small nation. Everyone's related to everyone else. So, complaining about the corruption is a bit like criticizing your the uncle and great aunt. We don't talk about these things. Yeah. You know, yeah. So the corruption is a very easy way to describe how something that should happen doesn't happen. I'm not trying to underestimate the negative consequences of corruption, but you know, it's far more complicated than simply someone abiding by the rule because that you can write the rule in such a way that the most corrupt things are legal, like in the United States, and B, even if you have the same amount of corruption, people might perceive it very, very differently if it happens in Iceland as against
Or in Nigeria.
Nigeria, yeah, and C, you know, corruptions that a very complicated thing. So, for example, South Korea, Japan, these countries are very, very corrupt in many ways, even in their miracle days. Yeah. But
Yeah. Yeah.
one way of reconciling this was to say that their corruption was kept away from the key manufacturing sectors. Huh? So there was very little corruption
Yeah.
when it comes to how the government is going to give the license for the next the automobile producer, and how is that going to channel money into a strategy industry, while there were huge amount of corruption when it comes to government buying arms from the Americans. Yeah. I mean, these generals enrich themselves at no end. Yeah. When it comes to
Yeah.
urban
Yeah.
planning, you had huge corruption where government officials would take money and advise them on the next road that is going to be built. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
there were huge amount of corruptions, but, you know, because of this the consensus on the economic development, it was not allowed to seriously affect the core of the economy. Yeah? So
Sure.
it's a very complicated thing. Yeah?
And I have a slightly complicated question. It's long, so just bear with me. It's from Suleiman Ibrahim Shehu. He says, Professor Chang, Nigeria has spent decades trying to build industries like textile and automobile manufacturing, committing billions in financing and repeatedly introducing new policies, yet competitiveness has not emerged. Firm level evidence suggests the issue is not primarily finance, but structural. Unreliable power, weak logistics, and fragmented coordination. So capital is often absorbed into survival rather than productivity. In that
Mhm.
context, do special economic zones offer a credible way to create islands of coordination that can overcome these constraints, or
Mm.
do they risk becoming isolated enclaves without broader spillover, especially in a context like Nigeria, where there are over 30 designated SEZs, yet very few are fully operational or globally competitive? And his question is, and more concretely, what are the minimum institutional and infrastructure conditions that must be in place for special economic zones to actually generate sustained industrial capability rather than repeat the cycle or the cycle of
Mm.
underperformance?
Yeah. No, no, that's absolutely the spot on the kind of question. Yes, I mean, without the basic infrastructure, especially power, but also the road and other ports and other logistical the kind of infrastructure. However good that individual firms may be, you know impact will be limited. So yes, I mean in that kind of situation, you could benefit from special economic zones, but as the questioner, without policies to create spillover into other sectors, linkages with the rest of the economy, they will remain enclaves, which will create that very little impact. Yeah. So that you need to, say that you have built a special economic zones and have, I don't know, hosted particular industries, whether they are textile or shoes. I mean, Ethiopia has done quite a bit of that. Of course, South Korea and Taiwan were famous for that. But then you need policies to link these firms to the rest of the economy. Yeah? So you encourage people who worked in these foreign firms in the special economic zones to come out and set up their own firms supplying the foreign companies and indeed domestic companies, which will only happen if you have local contents requirement. Yeah? Because why should a multinational company, whether it's Korean or the Chinese, setting up this textile company, buy from local the firms if there are no requirements? Yeah, I mean they'll find it a lot easier to just import them from their home countries. Yeah. So only when you have a local contents policy, you can create opportunities for people who used to work in the special economic zones to come out of them and create input suppliers. Yeah.
Mm,
Only when
mm,
you have the kind of policies to kind of learn from the experiences of providing adequate power and logistics to these special economic zones through deliberate government policy to I don't know, go into joint venture with the foreign firms that build this the power and logistical capabilities, you can then transfer those the know-hows to the rest of the economy. Yeah?
Sure, sure. Can I get two more questions in because we're down to our last 2 minutes?
Yeah.
And the first one is from Chudi Obi. Do you think the Chinese economic bubble will pop? And the second question is from Abdul Rauf Aliyu. If you were a young Nigerian economist today, starting with a clean slate in 2026, would you still fight to build a 20th century industrial state? Or would you conclude that we need an entirely new post-industrial logic of sovereignty that your current framework hasn't yet accounted for?
Mhm. Yeah, well, Chinese economic bubble, yeah, there are the bubbles in China, but I think the biggest bubble in the world at the moment is the American bubble. So yeah, I mean, the Chinese real estate and the financial bubbles the could pop, but the effect will be less the damaging because the China does not have an open capital market. Yeah, I mean, once you have that, then whatever little problem you have in terms of your own bubble becomes even worse because foreign investors come in to take advantage of bubble and then they go out. Yeah. So at the moment, I think you should get more worried about the American bubble than the Chinese bubble. Uh, Post-industrial society is a myth. Yeah, I mean that we are producing and consuming even more material things than before. Yeah, it looks like we are dominated by services because the productivity growth in manufacturing is much faster in services, and in terms of employment composition, manufacturing is becoming less and less important. Yeah, but in the end, we are material beings. Yeah, I mean, you cannot live on simply talking to AI or watching Netflix. Yeah, you have to eat, you have to move around, you have to produce material goods. So please don't get seduced by this logic of sorry, argument of the post-industrial society because we are not living in one of those. Yeah,
Fantastic.
just to illustrate, countries like Switzerland, Singapore, they are touted as examples of post-industrial prosperity based on banking and high-end tourism and so on. These are two of the most industrialized nations in the world, yeah, measured by manufacturing output per capita. Yeah, so go figure. As the
Thank you.
American.
Thank you so much. And just to gift you the last minute, is there something you want to talk about that I didn't get to?
No, no, no. We've covered a lot of ground, and yeah, I mean, of course, there are many things that we could have gone deeper, and there are a few more examples that I could have used. But yeah, I mean, basically, I think I've said most of the things that I want to say. So thank you, everyone, for listening to me,
No,
and
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Chang. And to our viewers and participants, I guess my key takeaway is that Africa does not need to copy the past. The world has changed, but your central message lesson remains urgent, that development is never passive. Markets alone do not rearrange a nation's destiny. Capacities are built, firms learn, societies coordinate, and choose who they want to become. And, that's my takeaway from this conversation. And until next time, let's keep building that society we want to live in. Thank you so much, Professor Chang, and thank you
Thank
everyone
you.
who joined. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.